call that my mom voice. I call that my drum major voice from when I was in high school, because you have to be really loud then. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming this morning. On behalf of United Way and our staff and our board, we want to welcome everybody. We're really, really glad that you're here. As we get started, I think it's really important to just kind of set the stage for why we're here and what we're hoping to accomplish this morning. About 6 years ago, United Way of Southwest Michigan started going down this path of creating a deeper understanding of what our community wanted itself to be. Trying to understand people's aspirations for themselves, for their community, really turning outward to understand what our work should look like to be more relevant in the community. So here we are 6 years later with not a whole lot to show for it. Because our staff, our organization, never really invested the time and resources and effort that we needed into doing this very new and very different yet very vital work. And I'd like to say that capacity was the only thing that held us back, but it really wasn't. I think one of the biggest things that held us back, honestly, was fear. Because if you're really going to turn outward, and if you're really going to ask the community what they want for themselves, what they want to be, what they aspire for themselves, you have to be ready to hear what they're going to say. And we weren't. And I'm not even sure that we're 100% ready right now, but that's why we're all here. Because we realized that as our organization, we could not do this work ourselves, that we needed to band together with other entities to stand side by side with us and hold us a little bit accountable for actually going down this path. So we've partnered with the collective impact efforts in the community that we're involved with. The Berrien County Great Start Collaborative, the Cass County Great Start Collaborative, Berrien College Access Network, and Be Healthy Berrien. Because as we sit at all of those steering committee tables, every single one of those efforts is talking about, man, we really need more input from the community. We really need to know what the community wants. And when you've got all these groups that are saying that they need the same kind of information, it just makes sense to bring us all together and try and gather this information together. Because ultimately, the information isn't, hey, Zach East, what do you think United Way should be doing in the community? It's not about us. The question is, Zach East, what do you want your community to look like? And when we get that information, that public knowledge, then that helps all of us shape our work in a way that is much more real and relevant and will actually make the change happen that we need to happen in our community. So that is why we are here today, to understand and learn more about how we can build hope and dignity and community both in our work and through our work for the people that we are here working on behalf of. So I'm really excited that you are all here. I know you're going to be really inspired by what you hear today. And then we work together to figure out what we do with this to move our work forward. So I am really, really honored and pleased to introduce our speaker, Rich Harwood. The first time I heard him speak was actually, where's my GSC peeps at? The first time I heard him speak was at a Great Start Collaborative convening, probably 10 years or so ago. And then I've since had opportunity to hear him speak at a Michigan Association of United Ways conference. I've gone to his training at the Harwood Institute, and he has had a deep relationship with United Ways and across the country in helping us understand how to do this work. So after working on more than 20 political campaigns in 2 highly respected nonprofits, Rich Harwood set out to create something that was entirely different. He founded what is now known as the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation in 1988 when he was just 27 years old. 27 is like a magic number for us at United Way. So soon after, he wrote the groundbreaking report, Citizen and Politics, A View from Main Street, the first national study to uncover that Americans do not feel apathetic about politics, but instead held a deep sense of anger and disconnection. I think that's kind of true today, right? Over the past 30 years, Rich has innovated and developed a new philosophy and practice of how communities can solve shared problems, create a culture of shared responsibility, and deepen people's civic faith. The Harwood practice of turning outward has spread to all 50 United States and is being used in 40 countries. Rich has invested his career in revitalizing the nation's hardest hit communities, transforming the world's largest organizations, and reconnecting institutions like newsrooms and schools to society. In Newton, Connecticut, after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, Rich led the process for the community to collectively decide the fate of the school building. Rich is an inspiring and sought-after speaker who regularly keynotes major conferences and events. He appears regularly on major media outlets. He has written 4 books, scores of articles, and numerous groundbreaking reports. He's also written numerous studies and articles that have appeared on national media. Recently, he became a regular contributor to The Christian Citizen, a publication which provides thought on issues of justice, mercy, and faith. So I'm really excited that you're here to hear what he has to say, so I would like to introduce Rich Harwood.
Good morning. Oh boy, are you going to stay awake? Good morning. It's great to be here, Rachel. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Anna. It's always great to be with you. Anna and I have been talking about southwestern Michigan for years and years, and it's wonderful to be here. As Rachel said, we've been working across the state of Michigan with United Ways, working now with your state library and scores of communities across the state. We've done work in Detroit, in Flint, in Battle Creek, all across the great state of Michigan. So it's really great to be here. And it's really great to be with folks who are making a difference in your community, which is what I want to talk about this morning. It's also great to be here because, as you know, and maybe as you feel, at least as I travel across the country, so many Americans right now are frustrated with where we are as a country, no matter who you voted for in the last election. Right? Frustrated about where we are, frustrated about the division, frustrated about the acrimony, frustrated about the finger pointing. And I find over and over again that so many of us believe that we can do better and that we can be better in this country of ours. And that it's time that we figure out how to bring out the best in us and the best of us as opposed to the worst in us and the worst of us. Make sense? You with me? And so what I want to talk about this morning is, yes, how do you engage people around their aspirations, but in a broader way, how do we get our country and our communities on a more hopeful path? How do we get ourselves on a more hopeful path in our country? And I want to start with a personal story, in part to illustrate what I'm talking about, in part so you know a little bit more about me. When I was really young, maybe 3 years old, 2 years old, I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. In the early 1960s, as many of you know, that was a death sentence. That was a death sentence. There was a point at which the doctors turned to my mom and said to her, "Face it, he's a lemon." No one expected me to make it this far, and certainly no one expected me to have the honor of being here with you this morning. I spent most of my childhood and a good portion of my young adulthood in hospital beds. And I had vivid memories of all the doctors and nurses and specialists all surrounding my hospital bed, all talking about me, but never talking to me. I was shuffled from one hospital and one doctor to another where they kept trying to figure out a better diagnosis. And I was chewed up and spit out by a medical system that was intended to heal me, but actually did more harm than good. But I was lucky. Along the way, my diagnosis changed, which is what allows me to be here today. But even before that, I was lucky because there were 3 wise people in my community who came to save me, who ensured that I didn't fall through the cracks. There was my youth basketball and baseball coach, a guy named Mr. Rivers, who was a laborer at the local racetrack, where he taught me that I could exert myself physically, notwithstanding my illness and my own anxieties about that, and that he was the first one to teach me that it was okay to have hope and to hope. There was a gentleman down the street named Jack Pecker who belonged to our local synagogue. I'm Jewish. He belonged to our local synagogue with us. And he would take me to our local synagogue on weekends to do errands. And he was an electrician, so he would fix electrical problems there. And he would make me climb the ladder into the ceiling. And I remember even to this day standing here with my legs shaking and my fear of heights. And I realize now, looking back, that what Mr. Pecker was doing is he was making me climb that ladder to recognize that I could rise above my problems and fulfill my potential. And there was my next door neighbor, Mr. Brundage, who taught me to swim, but who also had a workshop in his backyard. And Mr. Brundage was a member of the John Birch Society. I was the first Jew he ever met. Right? I was the first Jew he ever met, and he told us he was an anti-Semite. But he used to take me into his back wood shop and teach me that I could build things with my hands. And so what I learned from these experiences, I learned what it feels like to have your dignity stripped away from you. I learned what it feels like to be invisible. I learned what it feels like not to have a voice. And I also learned that the labels that we put on people keep them in their place, but that each of us has innate capacities, like Mr. Brundage, who realized he was no longer anti-Semitic, and that he had innate capacities to lift me up and to contribute in this world. And that so many of us in our communities have these innate capacities that are now untapped. I decided to make this work my life's work because I believe that every individual in our society should be afforded dignity. I do this work every day. I'm here in southwestern Michigan because I believe that everyone should be able to fulfill their God-given potential. I'm here because I believe that every American, no matter where they live, the color of their skin, how much money they have in their wallet, what kind of car they drive, whether they went to higher education or not, should have a full shot at the American dream, no matter what. I believe these things. But I know that as much as I believe these things, and as much as maybe you believe these things, and we share these, that you walk through that door this morning, maybe frustrated about where we are. You walk through that door this morning, maybe wondering, how is it that we can make sure that no one in this part of Michigan is left behind and left out, and that no one's dignity in this region is shattered? You may have walked through that door this morning wondering, how is it that we can accelerate the efforts on obesity, or early childhood efforts, or post-secondary efforts, and ensure that everyone has a fair shot? You might have walked through that door this morning really fatigued and tired, and wondering and feeling like you're pushing a rock up a hill, and it's often feeling so big and heavy that it's going to roll back over you. And you're wondering how it is that you're going to keep motivated, and how it is that you're going to keep going. My message to you this morning is, we don't have to accept what's happening in our country today. And that we don't have to be as frustrated as we are. That our task is how we can reclaim and restore America's can-do spirit. Our can-do spirit right here in southwestern Michigan. And that in these divided times, when it's easier for us to hunker down, when it's easier for us to turn away from one another, when it's easier for us to get stuck on our grievances about what's not happening, that we need to summon ourselves to step forward with a new dose of courage and an ample dose of humility to focus once more and rediscover what we share in common in our communities, not that which divides us. We know there's a hell of a lot that divides us. I think the question for us in our communities is, will we focus on those things that we share in common? And will we figure out how to actively build on them? And will we do it in ways that tap our existing know-how, our existing wisdom, our existing knowledge that we already have in our communities but often is invisible to us, that we often don't see, that we often enough don't tap? I happen to believe that the change we need in our communities, no matter how important the next presidential election may be to you, or the fact that you just elected a new governor or whatever it may be, there is no politician in Washington, D.C. or in Lansing who can do what we need to do in our local communities. And we can't hold our breath waiting for them. They're not coming. I hate to tell you, they're not coming. It's us in this room. It's those of us in this room and in places like Des Moines, where I was last week, where we have to reclaim our can-do spirit and demonstrate what America is made of and what we can achieve together and what we can do together and how we can improve the lives of every individual in this region. You with me?
Yes. Yes.
You with me? So this is really important. So the fundamental challenge is, in a time when everyone is tearing each other down, How do we decide to build things up? How do we decide to build things up? And I think there's something really fundamental at stake that I want to mention that I know each of you thinks about each and every day, but I just want to remind you of and maybe even challenge you a bit to think about a bit more. I think right now in our country, at this juncture in American history, in our communities, there's something fundamental at stake. There's something very human at stake about what we are and who we are. I think there's something at stake about people's dignity. Do we really believe in this country that every individual should be afforded dignity or not? Or not? Do we believe that dignity is a birthright? It's not something you earn. It's not something you get at college. It's not something you get because you graduated some program. It's something because you are born here in the US and you are on our soil and you are afforded dignity. Do we believe that people, what matters to them should matter to us? Because if we deny people's reality, think about this, about what matters to them, we deny them their dignity. And so the question is, in our daily work, in the work that we're doing in our communities, in the ways in which we engage others, are we truly affording every individual in this region dignity, no matter where they are? I drove through Benton Harbor last night and spent a few hours there. Do we really afford every individual in Benton Harbor dignity? Or not? Or not? It's a fundamental question. It's not very difficult to answer. It is hard to do. Do we believe in hope? Do we believe in hope? Now, to me, hope is not a campaign slogan. I worked on lots of campaigns. It's not a campaign slogan. Nor is it something you simply put on a website. Nor is it something, I've written 4 books on hope. Nor is it something you put on the cover of a book. I believe hope is defined by whether or not a single mom with 2 kids believes that she can send her kids to a school that will educate them where tomorrow can be better than it was today. That's my definition of hope. That's my definition of hope. And so often in our society, when I was in Des Moines last week, a major funder stood up, a funder who works across Canada and the US, who happens to live in Des Moines. Actually, she lives in Cedar Rapids. She was in Des Moines. She stood up among all her peers in a room like this, and she said, I would like to believe that I give people hope in my work, but my work is really about false hope. I sprinkle a little money on folks. I ask them to create some change. I ask them to demonstrate some metrics. And then after 2 or 3 years, I walk away from them. She says, that's not hope. So often what we do is we promote false hope unintentionally. And for the work that you're doing, this collective impact work, this is really pivotal because we raise expectations that we can't meet, but we do it anyway. We tell people we're going to solve problems that we know we can't solve overnight, but we tell them that anyway. Right? We have small amounts of money and we promise huge change, but we know that we don't have the resources or the capacity yet to actually deliver on that huge change, but we do it anyway. We do it anyway. I believe if you're really concerned about hope, we need to get real about hope and promote authentic hope. Authentic hope. Where we demonstrate that we're willing to talk about the tough things, but we know change isn't coming immediately, we're going to have to keep working at it through small steps. We don't overpromise, we overdeliver. Right? And so this fundamental thing about who we are as human beings and how we engage with one another. Dignity is really important. Hope is really important because without hope, we're going nowhere. You know this. In this region, without hope, people will not step forward and engage with one another. And I don't believe there's enough real hope in our communities today. The other thing I think we need to focus on is community truly a common enterprise? I believe we need to make community a common enterprise, where no one has to go it alone and no one is on their own, where we are actually collecting and marshaling our collective resources to make a difference and pulling ahead. But as I'll talk about in a few minutes, so often our collective efforts, we confuse collective impact. This may sound damning. Right? Come here, be nice. We confuse collective impact with collective action, with marshaling our collective resources. And so as I'll talk about in a few minutes, who truly is part of our collective efforts? Is it just a small number of organizations? Or does it include everyone in our communities potentially? And how do we make room for that? How do we make room for that? So dignity, hope, common enterprise. It seems to me these are the fundamental things that are at stake. We've got to keep our eye on these things because these are the things that people are looking for that will help restore their sense of belief and can-do spirit that we can move forward. And so I want to talk about 4 specific things you can do. 4 specific things you can do to restore this sense. And before I do, one quick thing. No one believes, if you were to go outside this room, no one believes that whether it's on obesity or early childhood things or post-secondary things or whatever issues you may be working on, hunger and food security, no one believes you're going to solve these problems overnight. We've got to rid ourselves of that notion that somehow that's the burden we have to hold. Here's the burden I want you to hold, or the promise I want you to seek. It's that we need to get ourselves on a better trajectory, a more hopeful trajectory, with growing momentum, not diminishing momentum, where our civic competence is expanding, not decreasing, not contracting. Think about it. And yet so many of our efforts have diminishing momentum with diminishing civic competence. And so our trick today in our country and in Michigan, and in southwestern Michigan in particular, is how do we get on a better, more hopeful trajectory in the right direction, where people say we're finally moving in the right direction, with increasing momentum and ever-expanding civic competence. So I just want to mention 4 things that you can do. 4 things that you can do. And what I can tell you is, I've seen these work in places as hard-hit as Flint, where I've done work, in Youngstown and Battle Creek. I've seen them work in Mobile, Alabama, where they didn't pass a school levy for 40 years. And after I worked with them, they're now the highest performing schools in Alabama. We're about to go to Jackson, Mississippi, where their schools, much like in Benton Harbor, are being threatened of being taken over by the governor, all of their schools, not just their high school. And where they realize they've got to fix their schools, but what they really have to do is marshal their collective resources of their community around kids and families. That's really what's going to solve the problem, not just fixing schools. And we're seeing it with libraries all across the country. And my bias is this, just so you know. I believe in planning, but my bias is really around action. My bias is around action because everything that I've learned in the 30 years of doing this work, even though I know you think I look 29,
28.
God bless you. There is a place for you in heaven. Everything I've learned these 30 years is that when we get things, and this is really important for the efforts that you're undertaking, this is not some academic notion, and it's not something I read in a book, it's something I've seen in all the work over 30 years. That when you start to take action, even small steps, especially small steps, all of a sudden there's a serendipity that occurs. And through that serendipity, you discover new ways of acting, new partners, new pathways, and through that you create larger impact. You create larger impact. So my bias is, how can you start to take action that's relevant and significant and impactful in the community that gets you on this trajectory? Make sense? And so, 4 things. 1, as Rachel said, I think we need to turn outward toward our communities. Turn outward toward our communities. Now, this may sound obvious, and it may sound simple, but if it were, more people would be doing it. Right? I think we need to turn outward. We need to make a fundamental choice about our mindset, our orientation, our posture. This is a mindset about which direction are we facing. Are we facing outward toward the community, where the community is our reference point for everything we do, or are we facing inward toward ourselves? Now, I've done millions of dollars of research on this and work with organizations all across the US and in other countries. And what I can tell you is whenever I say we need to turn outward, everyone shakes their head. And then when I start to ask them questions, we find out they're turned inward. Why? Because we're taught to be turned inward. We're taught to be focused on our strategies, our own organizational strategies. Except so many of the challenges we face are collective in nature. We're trained to be taught to focus on our own metrics. We're trained to be taught just to focus on how much money we're raising. And so before you know it, we're hunkered down, inwardly focused on ourselves, and the community becomes our playing field, but it's actually not what we're actually trying to affect. It's where we raise money, yeah. It's where we implement our programs, sure. It's where we see whether or not we can move the needle on something, yeah. But we actually don't have the community in our line of sight. And it seems to me, if we actually want to afford people dignity, if we want to see and hear all people, if we want to know what matters to them, if we want to take on the underlying conditions in our community so that our strategies really are calibrated to what exists, not what we wish existed, then we have no choice but to turn outward. But that requires you as an individual. Now, I'm not talking to the group, I'm just talking to you as an individual. That requires each of us to make the choice to turn outward and actually have the community in our line of sight. That's a fundamental choice we need to make. Number two, we have to focus, as Rachel said, on our shared aspirations. I know I don't need to tell you this, but I'm going to say it anyway. People in our communities are sick and tired of professionals devising and designing solutions and imposing them on them. They are sick and tired of professionals believing that we know how to fix people. And if you only give us enough resources and time and partnerships, we will do a good job at fixing you. Right? People are tired of it. This is why there's so lack of trust in organizations and in leaders, not just in Washington, D.C., but in communities all across the country. There's a lack of trust, a lack of credibility, a lack of relationships. And so I believe we need to start to engage people authentically in our communities. Let me tell you what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean going to ask people what their problems in their lives are. Because when you ask someone about their problems, here's what's going to happen. They're going to give you a laundry list of demands. Then they're going to want to know why these things haven't been solved. When they want to know why they haven't been solved, they're going to know who is responsible for solving them. Sound familiar? When they want to know who is responsible for solving them, they're going to want to know who they can point their finger at. When they want to know who they can point their finger at, they're going to want to know how they can go get them. Right? Now we're right back in the toxic, acrimonious, divisive, polarized discussions we have today, and it's going to get us nowhere. It's going to get us nowhere. And when we don't do that, we do these fancy visioning exercises, you know, the little yellow dots? I'm not going to go through all that, but let me say this. Have you ever noticed what happens to those fancy reports, you know, they're 4-color saddle stitched on glossy paper? In an area like this, your 3-county area, right? How many people live in these 3 counties? 275,000 people or so. You know, they'll have 1,500 recommendations and 300 task forces. Have you ever noticed what happens to those reports? Right? Not a damn thing. And here's why. Why focusing on problems just get us in a cul-de-sac of polarized discussion, focusing on visioning exercises, they're not relevant to people's lives. The people who are overweight or obese that you're trying to work with, the people who need early childhood support, the people who need food security, they're not interested in some utopian dream, which is what those visioning exercises create. They want to know how their lives tomorrow can get better. They want to know how they can have some sense of authentic hope that tomorrow can be better than today. We've had our fill of being sold a bill of goods in this country. We got to get real with people, which means we have to be real, which means we have to be focused on what matters to people and what will make a difference in their lives tomorrow and the next day, not some utopian dream. And here's how we're going to get there. We need to focus on engaging people on their shared aspirations. When you ask someone about their aspirations for their lives and their community, they tell you something from their gut that matters to them, and they project out to what they want to achieve. When you ask someone about their aspirations for their lives and communities, they will tell you something that's actionable, doable, and achievable. I've done this for 30 years. It happens every single time. When people sit around together and talk about their shared aspirations, they realize that while we are divided in this country on many things, there are many more things, or at least enough things that we share in common that we can actually get to work on together. When people talk about their shared aspirations, they're sharing with us their lived experiences and their lives. And so what matters to them can matter to us. When they share their shared aspirations, people recognize immediately that there is no one organization, no one individual leader, no one individual citizen that can achieve these shared aspirations on their own. We need each other. We need each other. We can't go it alone because The Institute's doing a 30-year impact study of our work over the last 30 years. In every community where we've seen major change, and I mean really significant change, it all started by communities having these shared aspirations which redefined the terms of discussion in the community, got people focused on something they shared together that they could see themselves in. And here's the thing for all of you in this room. It was the force that aligned organizations to work together and get on a similar path. Because but for that, everyone wanted credit for themselves and to go their own way and to get their own money. And these shared aspirations is what changed the trajectory of the discussion and people working together in their community. It's not simply about holding community forums. Please don't talk to me about that. I can't stand it when people talk about that. This is about getting the knowledge of a community that will enable us to take action that matters to people, that's relevant in their lives, that enables them to believe that tomorrow can be better than today, and that aligns organizations in a strategic way to take effective action together. We need it. It's vital knowledge that we need to move our communities forward. You still with me?
Yes. Yes.
Told Rachel I'd be done by now. Okay, number three. Number three. We have to see ourselves in our communities as co-creators of our communities together. As builders, as shapers, as partners. Right now we are consumers. We are voters. But we are not co-creators. Not most of us. Maybe not even all of us in this room. We may be creating something, but we may not be co-creating something. We may not be builders together. I think the conditions in our country offer each of us in this room and all of us a golden opportunity that doesn't come along all the time. So many of the challenges that we face in our communities, like right here, require collective responses. We can't do it on our own. The obesity challenge that you're facing, this early childhood challenge, post-secondary challenge, I don't know if in these communities, but in many communities where I work, the opioid crisis, is that a problem here?
Yes. Yeah.
The opioid crisis, education, stuff that's happening in Benton Harwood, the high school. You could fix that high school, it's still not going to fix what really needs to happen there, right? We all know that. And everyone who lives in that community knows that. You don't need a PhD for that, right? So many of the challenges require a collective response. And here's the other part that goes with this. So many Americans today are yearning to regain a greater sense of control over their lives, to be part of something larger than themselves, and to make a difference in one another's lives. I'm not talking about everyone, but I'm talking about enough of us who have that yearning. And when you put those two things together, it means that we can marshal our collective resources to take shared action on the challenges that we face together. Now let me restate what I said earlier. That's not collective impact. Collective impact is typically a bunch of organizations sitting around a table working together. I'm talking about marshaling our collective resources in a community that includes everyone. That includes everyone. Those three men I talked about who saved my life, they had innate capacities that in most efforts in communities we wouldn't recognize their innate capacities. And yet they had innate capacities to lift me up as a child and lift up other kids to make sure that they could move forward, right? And so the question is, how is it that we no longer turn inward and focus just on the usual suspects who have to sit around the table on our collective efforts, but we turn outward toward the community and begin to recognize people's innate capacities and how we can marshal them against the challenges that you want to address, right? How can we value both institutional responses and human scale responses? And align them so that we're all moving in a common direction, taking shared responsibility for our communities. I can't think of a challenge in our society today where that's not important. Where we need both institutional responses and human scale responses. So many of the challenges we face today, the trusted actors are small organizations embedded in neighborhoods and communities. You know this, right? So many of the trusted people who can act on this are neighbors and teachers and people in faith institutions and wives and other places that we need to marshal together to move forward. And here's the other thing I think we need to focus on. and that we've recognized over and over again in our work. That is, as important as big plans are, it's the small steps that actually create the new trajectory. It's the small steps that actually together create the momentum. It's the small steps that actually create the civic confidence where we can rebuild our relationships and trust and belief in one another. So there may be people coming through southwestern Michigan who tell you, build these big comprehensive plans, and unless you achieve some huge change, your efforts are worthless. And I'm here to tell you they're lying to you. They're lying to you. And they're getting to you to misuse your limited resources. It is better to start with small steps that you actually can achieve and get something done on, and get moving in the right direction, and build confidence and momentum. And through the serendipity of those small steps, you will discover new small steps and new partners and new pathways for taking action. When we get locked into comprehensive plans, we turn inward. We simply try to implement the plans, and we simply try to do it on our own a lot of times. And so if we're going to be builders and co-creators in our communities, we've got to turn outward toward our communities. We've got to know our shared aspirations and what matters to people. And we've got to engage people in helping to co-create our communities together. Not simply move the needle on issues. I'm in favor of impact. We measure a lot of what we do. But I'm here to tell you how we do the work is as important as what we do. If we're going to restore America's can-do spirit, if we're going to restore people's faith in one another and in themselves, how we do the work is as important as what we do. People are watching us. They want to know, are they co-creators with us, or are we simply here to fix them? Are we here to build things or tear things down? These are fundamental choices. Are we here to root our work in people's dignity, create authentic hope, and make community common enterprise, or are we in this room going to go it alone on our own and fix people? It's a fundamental choice we face, and people want to know what we're going to do. Last point. I think we've got to focus on creating can-do narratives in our communities. This is really critically important for what you're doing right now, because I know you're making progress. I've read a lot of stuff before I came here. I know you're making progress. In the 30 years of doing this work, I found that the greatest hidden factor to whether or not communities move forward is the story communities tell themselves about themselves. It's our narratives, our collective shared narratives. Communities typically have more than one, but they're often our dominant ones. It happens that in most communities in America right now, the dominant narratives are ingrained negative narratives. And these narratives shape our mindsets, they shape our actions, they shape our behaviors, they shape what we say to one another. Think about the narratives in your own life, right? When something goes wrong and some negative narrative kicks in, and you start to talk to a friend or a family member about, this isn't going to work, they're not going to pay attention to me, no one's going to support me, right? We have the same narratives in our communities, and they're holding us back. They're holding us back. In Youngstown, where we were doing work on education, the narrative there was, we don't believe in our kids, we don't believe they have the potential to learn, and they're all up to no good. That's what people told us in the community. I suspect the narrative about Benton Harbor isn't a whole hell of a lot different. Or maybe other parts of your 3 counties. When we worked in Las Vegas, the narrative was, I'm for me and you're for me. No wonder why they couldn't take shared action on it. I'm for me and you're for me. In Oak Park, Illinois, where I just was a few weeks ago, they were one of the first communities in America to integrate housing in the 1960s. Their narrative still to this day is, we were the first community to integrate housing and schools in the 1960s. But here's the thing. There's an underlying narrative in Oak Park, which is a suburb of Chicago, right? Which you may have seen the special on their high school there. The underlying narrative right now is, we have an equity and inclusion problem in our schools and communities. So the underlying narrative is actually running counter to the 1960s narrative, except no one wants to recognize the new one, which means they're stuck, celebrating their past successes, which is part of their history. But it's preventing them from seeing what's actually on the ground in reality. So my question to you is, what's the narrative here? What's the narrative here? it seems to me that we need to pay a lot more attention to how we create an authentic can-do narrative. This narrative, I hope this doesn't insult anyone here, cannot be driven by public relations consultants. It's not an advertising campaign. It's about finding stories in the community that are bubbling up, where people are coming together in new ways, the ways in which I've been talking about, where we can shine a light on them and start to tell those stories and spread them in our communities. Now here's the problem, or the challenge. What we found in our work is that those of us who do this work every day, these stories are often invisible to us and invisible to the people in our communities. And so we just created a new tool, which is called Making the Invisible Visible, right? About how do we make these stories visible, and how do we talk about them in authentic ways, and how do we combine enough stories over time so that we can combat the negative narratives that we have in our communities, or at least create strengthen our can-do narrative. And so if you were to ask me what's one of the most important things you can do in this community as you're doing this work, in addition to turning outward, focusing on shared aspirations, engaging people as co-creators, I would say you have to focus intentionally on creating a can-do narrative, rooted in authentic actions that are emerging from the community. And you have to be prepared to do this for 5 years. This doesn't happen over 6 months or a year. It happens over years. So unless you're willing to make the commitment for 3 to 5 years, don't bother. Because it's just going to be more PR that people are going to believe is a false bill of goods. So make the commitment, do it. It's one of the most important things you can do. Let me just conclude with this. As Rachel said in the intro, you all remember the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, right? Back in 2012. A few weeks after that massacre, I got a call from the mayor of Newtown, one of the best public leaders I've ever worked with in all of the US, a woman named Pat Lodra. And she asked me whether or not I'd come to Newtown to design and lead the process by which the community would decide what to do with the Sandy Hook Elementary School, which is where 20 first graders were gunned down and 6 adults. And what I realized when I started doing this work is that this was about a school building, but it was about much more. It was about whether or not a community could pivot from trauma and despair to healing and hope. And I won't take you through the whole story, but there were all sorts of reasons to believe that this community was going to divide itself, that many people didn't believe they should even be having this conversation about what to do with the school, that people were still traumatized, that there were political leaders who were jockeying for position, that there were all sorts of national media who had descended upon the community. You remember all this, right? And so when I started this work and everything that we did was in public, it occurred to me that this was a recipe for division and acrimony and polarization for the whole damn thing to fall apart. But over a 4 or 5 month period, somehow or another, the community came together. And the community, notwithstanding their divisions and their challenges, ultimately made a unanimous decision to tear down that building, rebuild on a new footprint, and move forward together. It's a story for me when I think about what we're facing in our communities. It's a story, yes, of despair and of trauma and of the inexplicable. But it's also a story of human triumph, of human spirit, of hope. It's a story about how a community came together in the worst of circumstances and pulled themselves together to move forward. Now, you're not facing any challenges exactly like that. But in our own ways, in our own communities, we're each facing challenges. And you've outlined some of them in your work. And so our choice here is whether or not we will step forward, not simply individually, but together. And whether or not we will decide to focus and rediscover on those things that we do share common amid our differences, and there are real differences. And whether or not we will step forward to be co-creators in building our communities together in ways that afford every individual dignity, that make hope real in every individual's life, and that makes community a true common enterprise again in America. That's our challenge. And if you have any doubt that that's possible, just think about American history. Because time and time again, notwithstanding the stains that we have on our civic pattern, and we have real stains, we have come together and made progress. We have abolished slavery. We gave women the right to vote. We created child labor laws and voting rights and civil rights, and we've rebuilt communities. We've overcome diseases and sent people to the moon. We've done all sorts of remarkable things in our country together, never alone, always together. And it's time again to pull together and make community common enterprise where hope is real and dignity is afforded to every single person. Thanks so much for having me. So we've got a little time for questions. I love disagreements, thoughts.
Well, I'm not disagreeing. I think you had I don't think I disagree with everything. Yeah, no. You touched on it, but you didn't talk about it. You mentioned these 4 things we need to do, right? And I'm just going to say it because we don't like to face it. Benton Harbor there are major problems there, and we all do work there. And for the last 30 years, I know I have banged my head against the wall, started mentoring programs, done all sorts of things, but it comes down to 2 issues that have never been resolved, ever. And that's trust and leadership.
Yep.
So if, and I think this is where you're headed, if you do these 4 things outside the systems that are in place, you can get to rebuilding trust.
That's right.
Where people can actually work together and solve problems. Correct?
Correct.
So I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah, no. I mean, Flint obviously is a tough place. We were there in the midst of them losing 30,000 auto jobs in a very short period of time, right, or something like
I
that.
grew up in Saginaw.
So you know these, right?
Yeah,
So
tell me how tough you are.
yeah. No, not me. What's the situation? Although I'm from New York, so I'm happy to go toe to toe with you. Bring it on. Bring it on. I thought I was supposed to be polite. I'm in Michigan. As you know, in Flint, the mayor wouldn't meet with us, right? He was ultimately recalled. This is in the, right? And
Is that Woody?
yeah. And what we found there, what we found in Youngstown, what we found in Vegas, what we found in Mobile, is in hard-hit communities. This is actually true for robust communities too. Sarasota, where we're doing work right now. But in particular, in Benton Harbor, a place like Benton Harbor, is we've got to build, the way to build trust is to do the types of things I'm talking about and not to wait for the existing systems to come along with us because there's too much vested interest in them not coming along with us. And we have to recognize that. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, which we can go into, but they exist. And we can wish for those systems to change, we can hope for them to change, we can pray for them to change. They're not changing anytime soon, right? And so we've got to find places to rebuild trust in the community. We're going to have to find leaders in the community that people do trust, which means we're going to have different conversations to find those people. In Flint, we had to find nascent leaders and spend a lot of time helping them develop and helping organizations that the Flint Public Library, the Flint Cultural Corporation, Salem Housing, which was a select, we had to really fortify them so that they could do work. And then here's the other thing we had to do, and this is true in every place where I've done work, is you can't think that you're going to see massive progress anytime soon. We got to get that out of our heads, and we can't promise it to people either. It's not happening. The more real we can be, the more honest we can be with some modicum of hope, right? People get hope by them knowing you're facing their reality. We think people get hope by us bypassing their reality. No one gets hope that way. I can tell you, sitting in a hospital bed for lots of years, I didn't get hope when a doctor said, you're going to be fine. I knew I wasn't going to be fine. It was obvious I wasn't going to be fine. So tell me what we can do, right? So I think this is really critical, and we need to rebuild the civic infrastructure so that it has more capacity and energy and it's moving in the right direction. And what I find is ultimately some institutions will come, most won't. And instead of trying to get the ones, this is what we're talking about in Des Moines, instead of banging our heads against the wall trying to get the ones that are resistant, We've got to be on the lookout for the ones that are stepping forward, and those are the ones we roll with. We roll with folks who are ready to roll. Everyone else, keep the doors open, but we got to roll. We got to create some action, and we got to create some momentum. You roll with who's ready to roll, and you go from there.
Well, I think, piggybacking on what you said, I think one of the challenges we have, talking about the community narrative, is Benton Harbor's a problem, it's been a problem, it's going to continue to be a problem, and, oh, we're okay.
Right.
I mean, that's the implied thing. It's like having two kids, and one of them is the problem child, and what happens to the problem child becomes more of a problem child. And so I think we've got to be very careful about what narrative we want to tell ourselves.
Yes.
I mean, is the narrative only children and families are valuable, and seniors, well, they're has-beens? Or is the narrative community, families inclusive of multiple generations, communities that look different and may be different? I mean, we're not United Way of St. Joe, we're United Way of Van Buren and Marion. And they're very different in many ways. And I think that's a real important thing we've got to and it may be different in different communities.
That's right.
But still, I think we've got to be very aware of how we learn to talk over a long time about different communities.
Yeah, I mean, in Youngstown, so that was the narrative of Youngstown, right? They came out of the steel mills closing and everything else. When we did our first work there, I can't remember the exact year it was, they were still on the decline. People in the community said you can't trust anyone. The churches were seen as corrupt. There were, the mob was there. In fact, their congressman was thrown in jail, trafficant, right? And so one of the things that they had to battle was this narrative, both within Youngstown and within Mahoning Valley, because it was the same situation outside of the city. And so what they've done, though, is through creating pockets of change, as opposed to trying to create comprehensive change, those pockets now, and I can name them for you because they've arisen over 5-10 years, have begun to shift the narrative. But it took, again, what they focused on, and this is true in a lot of communities where there's any resistance or it's been hard to create changes, we keep trying to create comprehensive change across entire regions or areas or communities, when in fact in those places, we have a framework called the 5 stages of community life, which can help you think about this. But in those cases, what you really want to be thinking about is how do we create pockets of change that create this momentum, and then how do we begin to shine a light on those pockets and build networks between and among them and grow them out. And it's a fundamentally different approach to change. And I think, and I've seen it work over and over again. So yeah.
Yeah, I was, Linda, kind of touching base with you on what you were talking about. You know, I'm on the board of the Benton Harbor Promise Foundation. And so it's been interesting to hear students from Benton Harbor High School. And they're reading comments on Facebook from majority white populations about their fear of those kids coming to our schools. And so my gosh, the divisiveness is real. And it's been that way for a long time in the city. And so it's interesting for me to have the humbling opportunity to listen to some of these kids. Some of them are at LMC now and looking back and thinking that could have been me. Because now those kids are like also scared of going into those communities, right? There's just, and it's fear and anxiety, and it leads to mental health issues, and it leads to also narratives that become entrenched. And it's just like, my God, now or never in terms of this kind of work.
Yeah, yes, and we find that a lot. And, you know, so when I say we have a choice about whether or not we tear things down or build things up, when you think about tearing things down, it sounds like, okay, are you going to be acrimonious and divisive? But another way of tearing things down is exactly in from what you just said, which is we tear things down by the ways in which we now have imposed these narratives on these kids, who now face a double challenge. They face the challenge of whatever's happening in their own lives. They face a triple challenge. They face the challenge of having to go potentially to a new school where no one's going to know them. And they face a challenge now of being in an environment that's very different for them writ large. And so how do we start to engage in a fundamentally different way? That's what I'm talking about. So that's an example of where, one could argue, are we really affording those kids a sense of dignity? Are we really suggesting to them that they should have some semblance of hope? Are we really saying that this community, in some larger sense, is a common enterprise? Or are we needlessly going to divide ourselves up in a way that ensures that that can never happen? Because that's what's happening.
And I think still, building off Al, I can't believe I'm agreeing with you now.
Do you guys want to sit next to each other?
We see each other. No, and going off what they said, I think the trust, and I know you don't have the answer to that, how do we build the trust? So, you speak about the children who are reading everything that on media, and you've got the media, who isn't always the most unified source, right, of bringing people together. You have what they're hearing at home, you have what they're hearing in the classroom. But then you take the other communities around, who fear is a real issue, but trust is a real issue as well. So how do we get to those kids who are going to trust that the system is really, really going to work for them, and that they can trust the adults, they can trust the kids coming in that they don't know? How do we get there?
Right. Well, let's do this. I do have an answer for trust.
Okay, good.
And you do too. And so how is trust built? Let's just do this real quickly. Relationships, what else? What are other ingredients to trust? Honesty, what else?
Accountability.
Accountability, what?
Following through.
Following through, a track record. Is it one time or overtime?
Overtime.
Okay, so these are, I can send you all the research we've done on trust. It all boils down to those handful of things. So the question is, how are we creating an environment that allows for those things to give rise? Right? There are things we can do really concretely that would enable those things to start to emerge. That requires that we get focused in particular ways, in particular areas, not get distracted. It requires that when people start talking, so that's one part. The second part is that's not going to do enough to the ingrained narratives because it's going to be small actions. So then the question becomes, okay, so for those people who are helping to lead these efforts or in these efforts, will we have the courage to put a stake in the ground to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're for, and by the way, what's happening here is different than what you're saying. Let me show you how. Not let me tell you you're wrong. Let me tell you a story about how it's different and why it's different and how we got here. It's kind of like a parable.
And I think because Al, he has banged his head again. He's on a lot of several committees in the community. He's done a lot of work. And all of these communities have been told things. And like you said, how do we bring forth the action so that they actually believe this is going to be a game changer?
That's right. And in most places where we've worked with communities, hard-hit communities, this could be a rural community that's surrounded as well, right? But a hard-hit community surrounded by rural and or suburban areas, right? It's a prisoner's dilemma, right? Who's going to move first? And here's what I've come to learn. I don't like this, but this is what I've come to learn, practically, which is there's going to have to be a move from those cities, Benton Harbor in this case, to demonstrate that we're taking different actions that are believable, that we can then start to show outside Benton Harbor that things are happening. So the onus really is on us to start to demonstrate something because no one wants to come along. We know that. We could keep imploring people to come along. We can keep guilting people to come along. This is what advertisers and nonprofit communicators try to do all the time. It doesn't get us anywhere. So my question is, do we want to keep imploring people to think differently? I mean, you can do that with some people, but most people aren't. Or do we want to demonstrate something that's concrete and real and start to show and start to peel off more and more people who will come along and work with us. That's, I think, got to be the game.
I mean, traditionally, we're always looking inward, so the whole concept of turning outward is new, and although exciting, it seems like not knowing what next step, the context to it. So you kind of joked about community forums. So what does that look like in context?
In a practical.
Yeah, in the practical sense.
Well, one is, there are actually 7 things. They're in this book.
Oh.
So, I'm always told I don't plug stuff up. So buy the book. I'm sorry, did you hear me? Buy the book. Did I tell you to buy the book? But what's in it also is that it requires something, as you can tell from what I'm saying. I cut certain things out of my talk as I was going on, but it requires something of us to make this happen, right? There's a way in which, the reason why it's called stepping forward is because we need more of us to actually step forward to make this happen. It doesn't just happen because we run programs, right? So in terms of, for instance, getting people's aspirations, there are lots of different ways to do it. The reason why I said community forums is because I can't tell you the number of people who walk up to me and say, oh, I love your community conversations. And I'm like, well, what'd you do with them? They're like, oh, well, we wrote up a report. I'm like, well, what'd you do with the report? Well, you know, we got people talking about it. I'm like, please don't talk to me. Because honestly, the community conversations are the instrument by which we gain knowledge about the community, by which we then make strategic choices about what we're going to focus on, which enable us to develop better strategies, which enable us to figure out how we measure change so we know that we're making a difference, right? So there's a whole cascading set of effects. So as part of this first step, yeah, you can hold community forums. Do they need to be, like the mayor of South Bend just held this big town hall, right? He got his head handed to him, right? That happened in Richmond about Confederate statues and the governor, so we've been sort of telling people in Richmond, don't do that. You're better off having smaller meetings where you can actually talk to people, hear them, acknowledge them, and engage in real conversations. So one is we say keep these small. You can do town halls, we do them, but keep them small, 10, 12 people, where people can actually talk and tell you their lived experiences, not standing in a microphone for 2 minutes or 30 seconds. So that's one thing. You got to do enough of them in a community so that you see patterns, but don't get community conversation happy where you're doing millions of these. I mean, you can do millions of them because you want to touch more people and you think that's important, but what you're really looking for are patterns by which you can make strategic choices. When you've got those patterns and you have confidence in them, I'm like, let's get going. You can keep doing the conversations, but while you're doing them, we know enough to take action. Let's move. This is about action. That's why I said my bias is towards action, right? Always towards action. We have another tool called the Ask tool. It's 4 questions. It takes 7 minutes to do. Usually do it with individuals or 2 or 3 people. You can do that. In Australia, where we're working, they trained 100 people to do it, and they engaged 1,500 people over 2 days on the streets. Right? Now, that doesn't give you the deep enough stuff from the community conversations, but going back to Al's question, when people know that you're asking real questions, we did this on the streets of Detroit the day GM declared bankruptcy. The people in Detroit told us a fundamentally different story than what the president was talking about, his economic advisors were talking about, and what everyone on the radio and television were talking about. They had a fundamentally different story about their community than what everyone else was saying. That was really powerful for them and the people who talked and their ability to move forward, right? So you can use these ask questions because you can touch people one-on-one. In a place like that in Harwood, there's only 9,000 people. You touch enough people, they're gonna start talking to each other. That's what you want. You can go into a barber shop, a beauty shop, a church basement. That's where I would go, right? And begin to talk to people, but in small groups, always small groups. And when you talk to folks, you better be sure that you're gonna reflect back to people what you learned, because if you don't, you have now broken the trust. So that's the first step of trust. You talk to me, you owe it to me to tell me what you learned. You then owe it to me to tell me what we're gonna do together. You then owe it to me to tell me how we're gonna do it. I may even help design it. You then owe it to me to keep coming back or talking about how we're doing. These are all, I think of them as solemn promises we make to communities implicitly when we start to engage. This is what Rachel was saying. Do we really want to know? Well, you start this process, you are making an implicit solemn promise to people about how you're going to work together, right? I think the way we build trust is we follow through on that promise. We follow through on the promise. Does that help?
And Danielle, to your point, everything that Rich said needs to be done to be authentic about this is everything that United Way hasn't done with this in the past, which is why I say over 6 years, we haven't gotten very far, because we've done the community conversations, we've done the ask exercises, we've gathered the knowledge, and then we've said, great, bye, and we didn't reflect that back to people. We didn't follow up with them. We used it to create our agenda for change, but then that was it. And we didn't really go much farther than that. And so that's where we've learned all the things not to do, because we learned them firsthand, right? Because we dropped the ball, we failed in that process, which is why we're gathering all of you together to say, we have to do this together because this is bigger than just us, and we need all of you to help us make all of that happen. So as we work more deeply with the collective impact efforts, we've been talking about who can we work through to do community conversations? Who can we work through to do the ask exercise to get some broader input? Then what do we do to gather that information? What's our process to reflect that back to people? What's our process to reflect that back to all of you for your purposes, and then how we move together? So we've learned from everything you said not to do, because that's exactly where we failed.
Well, just to cut you a little slack, there are lots of groups that I'm fine with this. There are lots of groups who do these conversations to build a better way for their organization to be more relevant and significant in the community, right? That's like a baseline, and that's cool. That's fine. I think the challenge is, if in fact you're saying you want to use this knowledge to help mobilize a community to take greater ownership of itself and to solve some of its problems collectively, then you've got to go further.
Can I ask this? I know we're over time, but we have so many people that think they know what's best for Benton Harbor,
Yeah.
because we've all been raised a certain way or been exposed to a certain set of circumstances or education. We have our opinions because we don't know their reality, the people that are living inside the city. How do we, on the flip side of our gaining their trust, how do we teach the people who think that they know what's best for Benton Harbor to drop that misconception and actually try to really find out what's best for Benton Harbor?
Yeah, so when we work in communities, one of the things that we're really interested in is how do you build a critical mass of what we would call public innovators, people like Rachel, who can work together in a network and make things happen, right? And so what I would say is, first and foremost, what you want to do, and I think one of the reasons for this meeting, is how do you find the folks who want to work together on this, who are ready to roll? So that's step number one. At that point, I wouldn't worry about changing everyone else's minds yet. What I would focus on is, how do we begin to get the work going? And through the work, how do we begin to engage folks over time about what's happening? So here's one quick example, one easy example. We actually have a report on our website that's really worth reading about this, called The Ripple Effect, which is about our work in Battle Creek over 6 years. And it literally lays out sort of how they did this, and it's very akin to what I think you need to do here. So when you get this public knowledge, one of the things we ask you to do is don't start telling people they're wrong, which is our instinct, right? Because now we know the truth and they don't. And somehow there's been divine intervention and we've been touched, right? Believe me, we haven't been touched. So, or maybe you have, I haven't. So among other things that we teach folks is, when you have this public knowledge, you want to start engaging other groups about what you've learned, right? You may do that through emails and other ways, but you want to start doing that with other groups that potentially could be your partners or could potentially start to think about things differently. So instead of saying to them, let me tell you everything I've learned and why you're wrong, which is the message we usually say, however we say it, what if we did this? What if we said, here's some key things we've learned, not everything. What do you make of what we've learned? And what do you think it means for us? And and implicit in that is an entreaty, right? An entreaty is an invitation. It's an entreaty of saying, do you want to think with me? do you want to explore with me? Ultimately, do you want to work with us? And what I can tell you is some people will resist that. So going back to Al's question, when we did this with political leaders and other institutional leaders, in Eastern Kentucky, I did this with faith leaders because they were one of the biggest problems behind closed doors. That was a very heated discussion because they didn't like what we learned, right? They just didn't like it. But half of them said, well, now that we've learned this, we want to work on this. And so they stepped forward, they went to our Public Innovators Lab, and they're doing some of the best work in the community now. Because they raised their hand and said, I'm in, and they stepped forward and they started to engage. And so that's one step. The beauty about this region, I know it's geographically not the smallest, but population-wise, it's small. So if you think about how you can work in different places in this region, and how you can do that through networks, right? Because nothing happens across an entire community, it happens through networks. And how you can start to work, identify those different networks, things start to spread much faster, people learn about these things, and people want to get on board. And so that's this trajectory I'm talking about. So does that help?
Yeah.
So it's very practical, it's step by step. You have to be really intentional, and in being intentional, you always have to be open to serendipity. Because when you start to do this, people are going to start to step forward who you never imagined, you may not even have known they existed, but they're going to be ready to go. And you want to make room for them.
So I hate to cut off the conversation, but to keep a little bit on our timeline.